lively performances. Now, this particular session is going to be carried by our panelists, so super exciting to see what they have in store for us. It's a panel about contagion through history, and the focus is going to be about around placing the COVID-19 pandemic in context of other infectious diseases, as well as exploring how emotions, diseases, and behaviors spread. Now, at the beginning, to provide context, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot that was going on. Part of the things that sparked a lot of panic was the lack of information from the expert community, or the lack thereof, and the reactions. We saw a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and young people, resorting to so many things to cope, like substance use of other substances, alcohol abuse, and all of that, just to sort of survive what was going on. And so in this particular session, we're going to be learning a lot more. And I want to invite our panelists to take over the session, start by introducing themselves, and then just get us into what you have for us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be with you this evening for us, afternoon for you. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you all one effort that we made at our end to make sense of what it is that we were all going through. And so Contagion, our first fully developed exhibition, went online last year in April. And it is going to be, I think, a wonderful thing for us to be able to go into, the details of what actually happened, etc. But I think, instead of showing you the whole exhibition, which you can go and see online yourselves, because it's on until December 31st. So Science Gallery Bengaluru, nowtransmitting.com, or Science Gallery Bengaluru Contagion will take you to the exhibition. But in this discussion, what is going to be wonderful is that we're going to explore it in a more focused manner. So I'm Janvi Palke. I am a historian of science by training and also the founding director of Science Gallery Bengaluru. And I am absolutely delighted to have this evening to chat with a dear friend and an artist and researcher, Ranjit Kandlgaonkar, because, among other things, a work by Ranjit, which I was lucky to have seen in its initial stages as it grew in his studio when he visited London, and then he exhibited the physical piece in London, and then we took it online in a different format. So this is the opportunity, I think, for us to, in many ways, retrace that journey back to the drawing, but also why Ranjit even came to it. So Ranjit, do you want to say a few words introducing yourself, and then we can, go into the nitty-gritty of things?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for joining in. So I'm Ranjit Kandlgaonkar. I'm an artist and researcher based in Mumbai. And a couple of years ago, earlier than that, around 2009, I've actually been working on a longer project on the history of 19th century philanthropic trusts. So that have been operating in Bombay, now Mumbai. From the period of my research period was around 1825 to 1915. So in this 100-year period, which is a colonial period for India, there are communities that are organizing around their own activities. So my research kind of took me into looking at public health and social hygiene and organizations, or what I started calling institutions of care, which were organized around different communities, like and different religious communities. So Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Parsi, Beni Israeli, Baha'i, Arabic, all these small, from larger communities right down to the smallest communities that are there all in Bombay, and how they are kind of organizing their community-based activities. And the public health activities were ones that really interested me also, because a pandemic hit Bombay in 1895, and that was the plague. So the Bombay plague, which came to be known as the Bombay plague, was was a kind of a watershed moment in the city's history, because it organized the way the city was structured. It kind of brought the entire, it also questioned the colonial rule at the time, and it forced the colonial authorities to also pay cognizance to what is happening in the city, and actually kind of put in some structures in place. So I was within the governmental structure that is happening. Communities were organizing individually, right? And the plague became a way to kind of structure this, because if we even see and make the parallel to COVID, we start seeing that how public health infrastructural systems are working are immediately exposed when it comes to a pandemic. So the pandemic like takes no prisoners. It like just immediately kind of exposes how something has been run, how monies have been put into health systems, and it kind of just lays everything bare. So, and it's also this opportunity where within the philanthropic institutions that are stepping up, they kind of also become visible during this time. Maybe structures that were working invisibly. So yeah, so a lot of my research has been around studying the Bombay plague and how COVID kind of this exposed that. And Contagion, the show with Janvi, became even more prescient because our show went live right when India was having its really terrible second wave, which wasn't something that we took in account for, but it just happened around that time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just, I'm wondering if it would be a good thing to show the drawing and see, because I think there are many details in it which actually start making sense when you see them, right? So why bother, right? Like why bother with studying something like this at all? Because I mean, as I said, you started working on this well before the pandemic was around. And in fact, the drawing that you made was made well before the pandemic hit. And so I think what would be wonderful is if you can walk us through the process of finishing the first drawing and exhibiting in London.
Right.
And why would that matter, right? Like so the topics that that matter, say for example in the Hamwe festival, but also in Contagion, what does it tell us about what people go through during a Contagion? Because it's what is amazing is that in your drawing you picked out things which almost literally played out
in COVID,
in the current pandemic, right? So I think it will be great to know that, and then we can also, of course, look at what the digital iteration of that drawing meant and what it would So I think it would be interesting for our friends and colleagues who are with us this evening to see what the drawing looks like and why it is so prescient, as you said.
Right. So I need access to. It says host disabled. Could we
get permissions for screen sharing, please? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Could you say that again?
Could you give us screen sharing permissions, please?
I need permission for screen sharing.
Sorry, did you? I couldn't hear him.
So I'm trying to share my screen, and I need permission to share the screen. It's disabled right now.
We'd like to show the exhibit and like to show the drawing. So we need to share our screen for that.
We're trying to work on that. We should be able to let you know shortly.
Yeah. Okay. So while hopefully the screen share concern gets resolved, yeah, could you speak a little bit to the archive that you explored, and what were the, say, emotive or affective aspects of it that you were able to notice?
Yeah. Okay, I can share my screen now.
Excellent, excellent.
So should I go into?
Yes, 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 yes. Please, 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 please go ahead.
So this was the interactive exhibit that we did with Janvi and with the Science Gallery Bengaluru. This was this year.
Yeah.
This year. Yes, this was this year.
April this year.
Yeah, but the drawing that we put into this online format was something that I had made in 2017. And there is actually a small note that I think I want to read first.
Yeah.
Which is, I had written it as when I had kind of made this drawing, I had kind of written this note to go along with it.
Please.
So I just want to read this. It's like, so within the context of global epidemics, historical study, and I wrote this in when I was submitting my report for this project in 2017. So within the context of global epidemics, historical study of the plague might shed light on some of the errors that are repeated. Diseases do not go away. They just resurface when we disturb the balance of climate, the environment, and an ecosystem in temporary equilibrium. In my research, it is a subject I feel I'm only beginning to scratch the surface about. It has not only prevailed, it might even, as in the plague, it has not only prevailed, it might even be back, if the recent Madagascar outbreak is any indicator. So during my residency, there was a small plague outbreak in Madagascar while I was making the plague, while I was making this drawing in the welcome building.
Yeah.
So if the recent Madagascar outbreak is any indicator, just the way TB resurfaced in the last 2 decades, leprosy in any case has not been completely eradicated either. So we stand at a pivotal point in the world's history. If connectivity by ships and mercantile routes could cause global pandemics spanning years and the kind of death toll, although of course medicine has made advances as well as myths have been dispelled, then what are the consequences of the hyper-globalized model where connectivity isn't an issue? What is the outcome of that scenario? So this last question is basically, the answer to that is COVID, which happens 4 years later. And so this was, in some sense, I had written this as like a cautionary tale, because we have this kind of, the pandemic was it was on schedule in some sense, like every 100 years, with the way the hyper-globalized model and how we kind of expand. So the Industrial Revolution also is happening around that time, right? Which kind of then ends with where influenza and is the pandemic, and plague is the pandemic that kind of comes in that century. So we were due in some sense. And at that point, I thought we were 5 or 10 years away, not 3. So that was my kind of prediction. So that was the kind of feeling that I had. And I always made this drawing as a cautionary tale. It was to say that, look, we do these same things. There is this repetition. So a lot of the images in the drawings were things that I thought were important to highlight in terms of not what was there in the regular archives, but to read between the photos, to read even between the photos of the welcome collection photographs, which I studied in 2016 as part of the grant. So
Ranjit, can I ask you to pick like say the top 3 aspects that that you feel have really in a way surprised you by returning during COVID? And of course we can go over more of that later, but what are the top 3 things that kind of hit at you when you think of, dude, this was like the end of the last century, like not the last but the century before that one, and we are living through a new pandemic, but we see these things again.
So I don't want to sound cynical, but or even a little bit jaded, but I wasn't really surprised, very frankly, because if you zoom into this part of the drawing, this was a drawing. This part of the image was to show that when the pandemic hit, when the plague hit, that it causes an exodus. So this part of the drawing is called mass exodus, and it's to document how Bombay's population in 1896 almost halved. There were 800,000 people, and the number of people that escaped the city were 400,000. So half the city's population basically escaped. And we know the great migrant kind of like exodus that happened for COVID, where everybody that left the cities that had kind of the floating population that basically run our metropolises kind of had to leave because the state did not provide for them, or in some sense trap them in and blame them rather than letting them leave towards their home. So this document, this drawing, or this part of the drawing kind of becomes a marker of something that repeated. And then dotted throughout the drawing, there are various kind of other larger, like smaller issues that continuously kind of repeat. Also the idea of touch, like if you touch something, dirt, you know, the concept of fomite. Like, so fomite was something that every day, like people were doing these elaborate things to clean their newspaper before reading it, right? And they don't do the same thing now. So everybody washed their hands 5 times a day. And in our today's world of like meme culture, there were these kind of drawings of like washing it down to the bone, you know. So a lot of these things have to do with purity and how purity and miasma. So I did this other work called the miasmatic breath, where so miasmatic theory is something that continues to pervade, and it continues to kind of remain etched within our kind of imagination of a disease, of putrid, impure air, which kind of causes disease, right, and death. And one of these is this drawing here, which is about wearing stilts to avoid being in contact with the dirt. And this becomes this kind of, this is the other, so I should possibly probably explain what this archive is.
Yes, so, exactly. I think that would be, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to retract a bit, and I'm actually going to go to what we did in this drawing.
Yeah.
Sorry for bouncing and kind of.
Not in the least. I think it's wonderful to learn about history through your process, in a sense, right? Like, see, I'm a historian of science, and I can tell the story from the archive in a very different way from the way you tell it, right? And so I think it's actually quite interesting also for someone like me who is very familiar with the archive, but my approach to it is so different, right? And so, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating that you want to retrace your steps in order to help us understand how was the pandemic perceived, represented, experienced then, how are we doing it now, and why might it matter to actually look at history in interesting ways? Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of what I'll do is I'll do something technical. I'll kind of explain how I broke it down to making the structure of the drawing. So I'm going to switch the markers off for a second, and if you'll see, there are 2 goddesses. One is Sitla Devi here on the right, and on the left is Ola Bibi. And Ola Bibi is the goddess of cholera, and Sitla Devi is the goddess of pox. And she's also the goddess of health in general. So she plays a larger role in the Indian mythological goddess scene. And in some sense, she has now also been upgraded to the goddess of chicken pox. So generally it's skin related, right? So she has neem also in her hand, or it's on her mukut, on her crown. And neem is very interesting because for pox and for skin-related diseases, neem is applied to the body to cool it down. So, so she holds that as one of the kind of the signifiers. And so Sitla Devi and Ola Bibi here kind of they kind of stand in for cholera and pox. Now, cholera and pox, when the plague hit, cholera and pox are endemic in India. So I wanted these two goddesses to represent the two diseases, because goddesses are also representations of the people making offerings. In order to not get cholera, you pray to the goddess of cholera. So you create the myth of the goddess, right? Of her very specific, what is she helping you with? She's helping you avoid. So you appease the goddess of cholera. And I found this very interesting quote, which was in Colonizing the Body by David Arnold, where he says that a likely explanation for the virtual absence of a plague deity comparable to smallpox's Sitla or cholera's Ola Bibi is that the state's plague operations often preceded the arrival of the disease itself and were far more distressing. So it was the state's motive which provoked a crisis of comprehension, not the activities of an irate or capricious goddess. So this was so interesting to me, because what in some sense is also being said, that there's no time, because of the way the state clamps down on the plague by saying that we must not let, and although ironically the plague arrives through the mercantile routes of the state, right? And then it goes and moves through to Alexandria, and then to Europe, and then goes to South America, and then comes back up into Africa, right? Over a period of 20-30 years. And again, also the route comes through China, through Yunnan. So these kind of...
It also tells us, sorry to interrupt you, it's a footnote, the historian in me, which is to say that, I mean, when we think of pandemics, right, like if you think of the current mood we are in, so to speak, right, like we are waiting for the pandemic to end, and except what history tells us is that this is a very prolonged and iterative process. It takes various forms, and in many ways, like our colleagues like Adia Benton and others who spoke during Contagion, that's the point they repeatedly made, which is, well, among other things, when does a pandemic end, right? And so Dora Varga also spoke about it, and there's, so when does it end, and when do you say it has ended, and what forms does it take along the way, right? Like another thing that Adia brought up was also how the pandemic gets, well, in today's context, militarized or policed, and that's something you have that in the drawing. I'd love for you to come to that in a little bit, but yes, please continue.
Yes, so exactly, the surveillance part is a huge part of my research now. The surveillance, we should definitely touch upon that, because that's been some of the things that I've been kind of. It's like you're also reduced to when you do this kind of research work, you can jump between years. Like I can say 1895, and then I can say 1906, and then I can say in 1915 it was like this, and I can jump. But now, as we are living out COVID, we have to wait, because we are going year by year, and now I'm ticking off things that are happening. Like I've documented riots, but not too many riots have happened with respect to in terms of the plague as compared to COVID. There was some unrest on the Haryana highway, which I was documenting, where people were getting angry about being told to sit at home, and they broke windshields and trucks. They destroyed trucks, etc. So, but
it's taking different forms. If you see globally, there have been different kinds of unrest, right? Like, and again, for different reasons. I think in many ways, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests became a huge part of, the inequity that COVID highlighted and accentuated.
Absolutely.
But also the anti-vaccine protests or anti-masking protests that have taken place. So politically on different sides, but the fact that people felt in a way denied or oppressed, or basically that they weren't actually being treated the way they would like to. So in a sense, a sense of what he calls a crisis of comprehension, right? Yeah. A crisis of comprehension of what's happening around you, which leads to lots of emotions, right? Like which could be anger, which could be sort of, denial, which could be, of course, other kinds of deeper melancholy and loneliness from having been locked down, etc. So we can see that crisis play out, but in different forms, in different places, depending on how this is. And to seek explanations for that is also going to be interesting, but as you rightly said, we are living through it. We are like literally counting things month by month, if not week by week.
Yeah. And you have to kind of then, and my whole practice is about stepping back before I engage. So this is new for me also in some sense.
Yeah. No, but I think that's exactly what you're drawing in many ways provided for Contagion, right? Like yours and Christos Linteris' essay on epidemic photography during the plague. I think what both these exhibits provided was for those who came in and spent time on those to provide that distance. In fact, so you were not able to, but our audience, I think, has been able to step back from what they're going through in order to make meaning or make sense of what's happening around them through the drawing or the photograph that Christos provided, right? Like, so I think that in that sense, you've been able to provide that
the framework of a kind of what is in some sense unfolding.
Correct.
And it's also about negotiating how. So what's interesting for me is looking at my plague research and looking at COVID, and there's always this comparative framework immediately that's popping up where I'm like, oh, this happened, and I'm not surprised it happened, but it happened, and oh, it didn't happen this way. This is what time has meant for, say, the migrant crisis bit of it, and governments reacting to it, and of course locally in terms of the Indian context, and then the farmers' protest also that ties into that, or for example, I mean, to come back to this main archive of the plague structure. I wanted also, other than the whatever archival records were there, I wanted to look very specifically at alternate archives and kind of
So could you tell us a little bit more about which archives you looked at?
Yes.
What did you find there? How long did it take you to do that work, and how long did it take you to draw?
Yeah. Okay. So I looked at specifically two or three main archives, which were whatever I found at the Welcome collection, which were a series of photographs. I'm going to show you an example of that. For example, this is one of the images, which is, they show images of the British soldiers in Hong Kong, sifting through objects from suspected plague houses. Now, the plague officer from Hong Kong was called to tackle the plague in Bombay, right? It's part of the colonial kind of the circuit. So that similarity is there. And these images are also very interesting images because they are staged images. They are staged to show the authorities doing work of kind of this whole idea that the houses that need to be clean, right? So of a certain kind of presence. And then so in this photo, for example, what becomes, so if you see this, if you zoom in this image, you see this, they're posing. This image becomes
all posing.
They're all posing. So for me, what becomes very important is to look at this person here and what is going through this person's mind. That became the archive that I wanted to look at. Like I knew what this was, that in fact, the hosing down with carbonated water makes the rats escape into other quarters and spread the disease, right? But I was very interested in what is going through this person's mind, the subaltern experience of what is the disease, because at that time there is no knowledge. The knowledge is there, but it's not a knowledge that has permeated into the public. It hasn't reached the street.
Exactly what we're going through now as well, right? Like, or at least in the first 6 months, 8 months. But this is a moment also to stay, because I'm glad you mentioned that this is a staged photograph, because as Christos' essay, tells us, epidemic photography or public health photography is a form that emerged during the plague in the late 19th century. because we knew clinical photography, we knew medical photography, we knew sort of, but this is the first time, this is a public health situation where epidemics are photographed. And what are they trying to convey? They are trying to convey the control over people, the fact that the government or the state authorities or the municipal government is in control, the fact that this is out there in the street. So the photographs are seldom of inside the hospital or on the hospital bed or of the patient or of the, what's under the microscope. These photographs are always systemic, right? And that's the emergence of a certain kind of photography, which and as you say, it is staged. It is totally staged.
Yeah, and it's also this kind of I mean, it's all a version and enactment of the Riot Act. You know, for surveillance systems, like we see the same thing. If I mean, this is a good time to bring up like the 1897 Epidemics Act, which I studied for the plague, and then the current government invoked the same rule and the same act. So to kind of put in place a surveillance system. So surveillance systems, we want a surveillance system to function only through the mode of how it can improve public health infrastructure. While states use the surveillance network and the act to kind of make sure that any kind of dissident is kind of cut. And so the Riot Act helps because it doesn't allow more than 2 to 3 people to convene. It doesn't allow you to kind of protest. It doesn't allow you to come out and say or find out for yourself or take or to kind of do it in that particular way. So it's that very kind of rule that kind of got reinforced again. For the
which reinforces what Adia Benton said, right? Like, I mean, and she studied Sierra Leone, and that's what she said. The heavy presence in the first days of the pandemic, the world over, of police and paramilitary forces on the streets was so astonishing. And well, no, not astonishing in the surprising way, but it was just kind of there. And that led her to say basically that the epidemic will be militarized, right? And especially the developing world. But we saw that also happen in the United States.
For different reasons.
For different reasons, absolutely. Because historically specific trajectories.
Yes. Very interesting. So this is one archive. Sorry, I digress. The other archives were stuff like the Lister Institute, which had these maps that were drawn by officers. It will come up now. I think my net is a bit sketchy.
Yeah, there it is.
And then there were these other drawings which were made by medicals. This is made by the civil surgeon. So this is such a stunning map which I found in the Wellcome archives, because it shows that the plague is traveling across the barracks, you know. So what I did specifically was that in my drawing, if you see that the actual vector of the disease is the flea. So throughout the drawing, there are fleas that are there at different parts of the drawing. So you'll notice the flea here, and somewhere here else.
And some rats.
Yeah, and some rats. So unknown to the person who made this drawing, that the actual vector of the disease is flying across the drawing in some sense. So there are other things that are happening. So in Kala Ghoda, which is the statue of a horse in the southern part of Bombay. So I draw the Kala Ghoda horse that has fallen victim. So what is the effect of the plague on animals? Which is something that I wanted to talk about. Then people were put in carbolic acid, very dilute carbolic acid baths. And similarly in COVID, in Jharkhand, I can't remember some place in when migrants entered their own town, they were hosed down with disinfectant. And this is a complete repetition of 100 years later. So there are very specific things that are kind of just almost unsurprisingly repeating. And houses were burned down. So objects were thrown out, things were burned, people's clothes, kind of shawls or clothing. There's this part where it was also. So I looked at these very particular archives. I looked at the municipal records. I looked at. I want to look for the very. So yeah, this is something I wanted to explain, which is the Parsi, the Hindi Punch, which is a satirical magazine which was there in the 1890s, and which was used to lampoon how government is kind of, it offers comic relief. So the officials also allowed it. The minute in 1896 when the plague hits, I mean, it becomes this kind of potent critique, because it completely becomes, for the next 5 years, it becomes a cartoon that is completely used by the editorial board to lampoon corruption, what they are not doing, and this is a speculative drawing that is made by the board, saying that because one of the strange things that happened, that along with the plague, when people left, there are a lot of doctors and hakims and quacks, etc., that also left the city, that didn't want to be part of it. So they're saying that a dentist has left the city, which is why an amateur dentist that tries his hand with the tools. So someone that is just a regular kind of a craftsman is kind of using pliers to remove someone's tooth. So say that the dentist, that there are no longer any dentists living in the city because they all ran away due to the plague.
Yeah.
So this archive, I thought, was a very potent alternate archive, and it kind of gives you a sense of, rather than like this a photographic evidence, allows you to look at a very different reading of the plague.
Would it be fair to say what you looked at were sort of archives collected for what has become the history of medicine, so which are now housed at the Wellcome Collection? So they are sort of public health archives, and then the scientific archives like the Lister Institute, etc., and then a cultural archive, right, which is the Hindu Punch, which is a commentary on what society is in a way experiencing and responding to, often also through humor. So these. Yes,
absolutely. And I had one more kind of archive which was very exciting for me personally, was that I made drawings based on papers that were written by academics. So there were a couple of papers. There was one by Prashant Kidambi, and then there is this one by Aditya Sarkar. So I made a drawing. So this part of this drawing, which is mill workers actually attacking hospital premises, is something that I read in Aditya Sarkar's paper, and it just stuck with me as a visual. And then another academic and friend, Babasaheb Kambre, wrote about workers that were untouchables, who were asked to sit in trams to make them seem full, so that it was a kind of a vision of normalcy. So these were kind of alternate archives and readings from the state gazetteers, from papers, and from these kind of the cultural archives, which were things that I looked at. So this lunch break that you see is also the image that has loaded right now, is just the index of the municipal record, and in that it becomes, in some sense, an archive unto itself, because it's a very incriminating archive. In it you can see some of the reasons that where it's just the heading of what the archive contains, but the heading itself, when placed alongside or this thing, kind of incriminates the way that the officials are thinking about it. They're wondering who the carrier of the disease is. So they're saying, oh, it may be rats, it may be the flea, it may be because Pasteur and the Pasteur Institute and the doctors are talking about the vector of the disease, but it may also be the Gujarati traveler that goes every fortnight to Surat. He is the carrier. and then the line below that says it's the rat that is the carrier. So it becomes there's a racial index. So it becomes a racial index that kind of plays and works itself into it, which we are beginning to see even again in COVID, based on even through vaccination and such kind of systems. So, so these archives were ones that I wanted to kind of structure the drawing around. And in some sense, the two goddesses are looking in on the colonial theater, which is playing out, which is the clamping down by the colonial authorities becomes this form of theater of the initial couple of years. So in some sense, my drawing is the record of the first few years, I would say the first 5 to 7, maybe even 10 years of the plague hitting, and there are various other impulses within it that, for example, there is a sewerage system that is there in London at the same time, and there's talk of it in terms of hygiene that is only talked about when the death count or the mortality rate really is high in Bombay. So what I did was I speculatively placed the technological shown sewerage system as something that is not something that should be put in as a response to the pandemic, but something that needs to have been there to begin with as a system that is put in place for its citizens and not as a response to a pandemic. So I speculatively placed the shown sewerage system here. Yeah.
So a quick question to our colleagues hosting the session. I think we are pretty much towards the end of our time. Do we have a minute or two to wrap up maybe? Or do we have some more time?
I think we are coming to the end. You could use a minute or two to just bring it home for us.
We both, I have seen this process from the outside as a historian of medicine, but as a historian of science, and with an interest in history of medicine. But I've seen you work through the archives, do the drawing, exhibit it, and then develop this online version of it as well. We've seen that you've used state archives, you've used sort of history of medicine archives, you've used cultural archives, and you have used cultural frameworks. Probably mobilizing an idea which Christopher Bailey spoke of at some point, in the 90s, called paracolonial, which our colleagues Catherine Schofield and Dilip Menon are now developing upon. So, this is an interesting time capsule which provides us the crutches in many ways to make sense of what's going on around us. What is the one message you would like our audience to leave with, given that this is the Hamwe festival, this is a festival where, we are looking at affective aspects of cultural work, of political work, of health work? What would you say?
Don't ignore history is something that I would say constantly. I mean, we erase so much of it unless we go, for example, to a city where we actually physically see it. There's so much that happens that gets constantly erased, and we in some sense our behavior as a race, our behavioral patterns remain the same. So we always are kind of come back to and constantly repeat the same mistakes. So yeah, I mean, in some sense, that would be the takeaway. It's not, it's been grim, and I guess just hope that we can learn and build from it in order to kind of take it to a better place. Since we are, because what was really interesting to me is that there are generations that live between two pandemics. That are born after pandemics ended and have passed away before the next pandemic. So between the influenza and COVID. So they are complete kind of lifelines and generations that have not ever experienced. And we are not, unfortunately, there is a pre and a post for us. And this is a rupture for the timeline, which is a very interesting kind of thing that we need to kind of be very aware of.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very sound message, and of course, as a historian, it warms my heart to think that good historical thinking can be done through cultural work too, and it's not then it doesn't become in many ways the burden or the responsibility of the historian alone to do that work and bring it out into the public domain, but that archives and historical experience can be expressed just as seriously through artistic expression. Of which I think you're drawing, and this work is a fabulous exemplar. So thank you again, Injonge and the Hamwe Festival, for inviting Ranjit and myself to be a part of, what is otherwise a vibrant event happening, unfortunately, online, and we are sorry that we are not with you. Thank you again, and have a lovely afternoon.